It wasn't just a revolution, it was a vanishing. How did the world's largest land army, a steel wall of 5 million souls, simply dissolve into the mud? Why did a system built for total war, forged in the fires of the Romanov dynasty, surrender to a sudden, infectious lethargy? And why did the people meant to be the empire's protectors become its most terrifying threat? It wasn't just a defeat, it was a tactical suicide. How did the world's most elite military machine crumble against an enemy it had already held at bay for 3 long years? But that was only the surface. History looks at the grand halls of the Winter Palace and the thundering speeches of the Bolsheviks, but the cameras and the chronicles missed the true turning point. They missed the one soul who understood that the rot wasn't in the logistics, but in the heart. The only warning came from a peasant woman the generals laughed at. A woman with a scarred face and a rifle she knew how to use better than any man in the room. They ignored her because she was just a villager with a mad idea. Why did the Russian High Command ignore the only tactic that could save them? The answer wasn't in the classified vaults, but in the hands of the underdog. Petrograd, May 1917. The city doesn't feel like the capital of a global power. It feels like a patient in the final stages of a fever. The air is thick with the scent of cheap tobacco, damp wool, and the peculiar, sweet smell of a civilization in its death throes. The Great War has been grinding for 34 months, and the Russian spirit has finally snapped. In the trenches of the Eastern Front, the great Russian soldier has become a ghost of himself. They are no longer a fighting force, they are a mob. They trade their boots for schnapps and their duty for the seductive promises of agitators. This is the great fatal flaw in the imperial machine. When the Tsar fell in February, the chain of command didn't just break, it evaporated. The mechanical failure of this collapse is precise and surgical. It is found in a single piece of paper. Order number 1. Think of a massive steam engine. For centuries, the pistons have been governed by a rigid series of valves, the officers. Order number 1 essentially told the steam it no longer had to obey the valves. It handed the power to soldier committees, meaning every tactical decision, every movement, and every shot fired had to be put to a vote. In the high-stakes physics of war, a committee is a death sentence. While the German artillery is being calibrated, the Russian soldiers are holding a meeting to decide if they feel like fighting today. The result is a total mechanical failure. The engine isn't just stopping, it is tearing itself apart from the inside. While the system in Petrograd debates the politics of the abyss, one woman walks through the wreckage of the morale. Maria Bochkareva. She does not look like a savior. She is short, sturdy, and her skin is weathered by the harsh sun of the Siberian fields and the biting frost of the trenches. She is a veteran, a woman who petitioned the Tsar himself to fight when the war began. She has been wounded 3 times. She has seen the great Russian soldier at his best, and now she sees him at his most pathetic. She walks past the barracks and sees men warriors who once struck fear into the Kaiser's heart, now lying in the dirt, drunk, trading their rifles to the enemy for a handful of cigarettes. She realizes a devastating truth. The front line isn't failing because they lack lead or bread. It is failing because they have lost their shame. The friction between her spirit and the massive system begins in a small, wood-paneled office. She has clawed her way through the bureaucracy to reach the man at the top, Alexander Kerensky, the head of the provisional government. Kerensky is the embodiment of the new Russia, polished, intellectual, and utterly detached from the mud. He looks at Maria not as a soldier, but as a curiosity, a distraction from his important speeches. He leans back in his chair, his hands clean, his uniform pressed. He adopts the stance of the crystallized arrogance that defined the era. "Maria," he says, his voice dripping with a patronizing warmth. "The men are tired. They are intoxicated by the idea of freedom. We cannot force them to die for a cause they no longer believe in. What could you possibly offer that my generals haven't already tried?" Maria doesn't blink. She doesn't use the language of the intellectuals. She uses the language of the earth. "The men have forgotten they are men," she says, "because there is no one left to remind them of what they owe to Russia. Give me the women. Give me the wives, the sisters, and the daughters. Give me the ones the world has stepped over, and I will give the men back their honor." Kerensky laughs. It is a dry, thin sound. To him, the idea is an absurdity, a joke to be told at the next cabinet meeting. He believes the manual of war is a masculine text. He assumes that a woman's presence on the battlefield would be a circus, a mechanical failure of social order. He treats her warning as a minor budget issue, a flight of fancy from a woman who has spent too much time under shell fire. He believes his speeches can bridge the gap. He believes the system is too big to fail. But the boss, in this case, the cold reality of the German spring offensive, is already preparing its response. While Kerensky smiles and dismisses the peasant woman, the enemy is tightening the noose. The silence in the east isn't peace. It is the indrawing of a breath before a scream. "Fine," Kerensky says, waving a hand as if swatting a fly. "Recruit your women. Form your battalion. Let the world see the battalion of death. It will be a fine piece of propaganda before the end." He thinks he's giving her a toy to play with. He thinks he is humoring a mad woman. But Maria Bochkareva isn't looking for a toy. She is looking for a razor. While the system screams in panic and the generals wait for a miracle that isn't coming, Maria is already moving into the shadows. She is heading to the streets of Petrograd, to the factories and the kitchens, to find the fuel that the great Russian army has run out of. She is about to build something the experts claimed was impossible. She is about to prove that when the massive system fails, the only thing left to hold the line is the spirit of those it chose to ignore. But the cost of this defiance is higher than she can imagine. For every action, there is a brutal reaction, and the very men she seeks to shame are already watching her from the barracks. Their eyes filled not with inspiration, but with a growing, dark resentment. The transition from the parlor to the parade ground begins with the sound of a razor. June 1917. The training grounds of St. Petersburg are a stark contrast to the chaotic, drunken streets of the city. Here, the massive system is being rebuilt, not with grand speeches, but with the brutal shedding of identity. 2,000 women teachers, housewives, servants, and daughters of the nobility stand in a line that stretches into the history books. One by one, they sit in wooden chairs. One by one, their hair falls to the dirt in long, silent cascades of silk and braid. For these women, The black box of their transformation is a total surrender of the self. In the Russian society of 1917, a woman's hair was her dignity, her beauty, her very place in the social order. By shearing it, they are not just preparing for helmets, they are amputating their past. Maria Bochkareva moves among them like a shadow. She does not offer comfort. She offers the discipline of the knout. In the military manual of the era, discipline was a matter of regulation. But Maria knows that for this unit, the 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death Discipline must be a physical weight. She treats them with a severity that would make a Tsar's drill sergeant flinch. She strikes them for sloppiness. She denies them sleep. She demands they march until their boots are filled with blood. The experts from the high command visit the camp, watching through gold-rimmed spectacles. They see women struggling under the weight of the Mosin Nagant rifle, a 10-pound length of wood and steel designed for a man's reach. They see the fatal flaw of biology. They whisper that a woman's collarbone will shatter under the recoil of a heavy infantry rifle. They claim their nervous systems are too delicate for the drum fire of modern artillery. They scoff at the quiet, rhythmic thud of boots on the packed earth. They believe they are watching a theatrical performance, a desperate stunt by a failing government. They treat the training as a joke. But they have fatally underestimated the ghost in the machine. While the male regiments in the neighboring barracks are busy voting on whether to obey orders, Maria's women are learning the logic of the bayonet. They are not debating politics. They are practicing how to slide 12 inches of cold steel between a man's ribs without getting the blade stuck in the bone. While the system screamed in panic, debating the fine points of Marxist theory, these women were already in the dark, holding the silence that would soon terrify their enemies. The movement toward the front is a slow, agonizing crawl by rail. The battalion of death is packed into cattle cars, the air thick with the smell of grease and the metallic tang of the rifles they spend every waking hour cleaning. As the train rattles toward the Smorgon in front, the resistance personified makes its appearance. At every stop, the train is surrounded by male soldiers. These are the men Maria intended to shame, and their reaction is not one of renewed honor. It is one of venomous arrogance. At a siding near Minsk, a group of soldier committees surrounds Maria's car. They are disheveled, their tunics unbuttoned, their eyes bloodshot from home-brewed vodka. A single representative, a sergeant who has traded his stripes for a red armband, steps forward. He represents the crystallized arrogance of the crumbling system. He mocks them, leaning against the side of the car with a jagged yellow smile. "Why are you here, little sisters?" he sneers. "Do you think your pretty faces will make the Germans stop shooting? Go back to your kitchens. We have decided this war is over. Why should you die for a government that can't even feed us?" Maria stands at the door of the car. She doesn't look like a little sister. She looks like a monument carved from Siberian granite. She doesn't offer a speech. She simply looks at the man's rifle rusted, the bolt clogged with dust, and then at her own, which gleams like a surgical instrument. "We are here," she says, her voice a low, dangerous vibration, "because you have forgotten how to be soldiers. We are here to do the job you are too cowardly to finish." The sergeant laughs, a sound like dry husks of corn rubbing together. He believes that because they are women, they are fragile equipment. He believes the manual of tradition says they will break at the first sound of a Maxim gun. But the boss, the reality of the trenches, doesn't care about tradition. The train pulls away, leaving the jeers of the men behind, but the atmosphere has shifted. The women realize they are not just fighting the Germans. They are trapped between two enemies: the iron wall of the Kaiser in front of them, and the rotting, jealous corpse of their own army behind them. They reach the Smorgon front in July. The landscape is a nightmare of splintered trees and craters that look like the surface of a dead moon. The air is heavy with the bitter aftertaste of previous failures. The massive system gives them one final insult. They are placed in a sector where the male regiments have signed an informal truce with the Germans. The men on both sides have agreed not to fire, spending their days drinking together in no man's land. The Battalion of Death watches this from their trench. They see the cruel irony of the Great War. The soldiers are more afraid of their own officers than they are of the enemy. The High Command issues the order for an offensive. The male regiments take a vote. The soldier committees spend 3 days debating the ethics of the attack. They decide to stay in their dugouts. They claim the offensive is impossible because the manual of the revolution says the soldiers must not be exploited. But Maria Bochkareva does not vote. She stands on the fire step, looking across the wire at the German lines. She sees the blind spot in the German defense, the arrogance of an enemy who thinks the Russian army is already dead. She turns to her 200 women. They are no longer housewives. They are no longer daughters. They are the impending doom that the system refused to believe in. "When I climb," she whispers, the sound carrying through the damp morning air. "You climb. We do not look back. We do not wait for the men. If they will not lead, we will show them how to die." The silence of the morning is absolute. The German sentries are relaxed, drinking coffee, convinced that the Russians are too busy arguing to attack. They believe their position is secure because the system told them so. But they have forgotten that a system is only as strong as its most ignored component. A single whistle blows. It isn't a loud, brassy blast. It is a sharp, thin note, a crack in the silence of history. Maria Bochkareva reaches for the top of the trench. Behind her, 200 pairs of boots scramble for purchase in the slick mud. 200 bayonets catch the first gray light of the sun. The boss is about to punish the arrogance of the world, and the men in the trenches behind them, the ones who mocked and jeered, suddenly find themselves watching a ghost story come to life. They thought the machine was broken. They didn't realize that Maria had simply found a new way to make it scream. The whistle does not scream. It cuts. July 9th, 1917. The Smorgon front is a landscape of gray mud and jagged, black timber. For months, the war here has been a stalemate of the soul, a quiet agreement between exhausted men to stop the killing. But as Maria Bochkareva's boots hit the lip of the trench, that agreement is torn to shreds. The black box of this moment is the sheer physics of the charge. In traditional infantry doctrine, an assault requires a 3-to-1 advantage and a heavy artillery softening. Maria has neither. What she has is the logic of the suicidal rebuke. As the 200 women of the Battalion of Death scramble over the parapet, they are not just moving toward the German lines. They are moving away from the gravity of their old lives. The German sentries, peering through the morning mist, see silhouettes that don't make sense. The gait is different. The posture is smaller. For a fraction of a second, the system of war stutters. The German machine gunners hesitate, a fatal flaw of chivalry that lasts just long enough for the women to bridge the gap. Then, the steel screams. The German trenches erupt in a storm of Maxim gunfire. The Boss physics begins its brutal tally. The air is filled with the thwack of lead hitting wool and bone. But the women do not pin themselves to the earth like the male regiments have done for years. Because they have been told they are fragile equipment, they fight with the desperate ferocity of the doomed. They reach the first German line. It is a world of confined vertical slaughter. While the male soldiers in the rear watch from the safety of their dugouts, the battalion of death enters the eureka moment of their training. They use their shorter stature to their advantage in the cramped zigzags of the trench, moving beneath the wide swings of the German rifle butts. They capture the first line, then the second. By the time they reach the third German line, they have done what an entire Russian corps couldn't achieve in a year. They have pierced the heart of the Kaiser's defense. But here, the cruel irony of history begins to tighten its grip. Maria looks back, expecting to see a wave of Russian khaki flooding through the gap she has carved. She expects to see the 5 million men of the great Russian army shamed into action, following the trail of blood her women have left in the mud. But the field behind them is empty. The male regiments are still in their trenches. Some are cheering as if watching a sporting event. Others are arguing. The soldier committees are holding another vote to decide if exploiting the breakthrough constitutes a violation of the new revolutionary principles. While the women are being torn apart by a German counterattack, the massive system is busy debating the definition of victory. Maria stands in a captured dugout, her uniform soaked in a mixture of mud and the blood of friends she has known since the hair-cutting chairs of Petrograd. She realizes the bitter victory of her existence. She has proven her point, and in doing so, she has ensured her own destruction. The men didn't want to be shamed. They wanted to be left alone. By being too brave, Maria has become more of a threat to her own side than the Germans ever were. The retreat is more harrowing than the charge. The women have to fight their way back through the very ground they won, carrying their wounded while their own comrades watch with cold, resentful eyes. Of the 200 who went over the top, barely half return unscarred. As Maria crawls back into her own trench, she is not met with medals. She is met with a quote of hubris from a Bolshevik agitator leaning against a crate of grenades. "You see," he mocks, "you wasted those lives for a yard of dirt and the pride of a dead czar. You aren't heroes, Maria. You're just obstacles to the peace." The aftermath is a slow-motion collapse into the dark. As the Bolshevik Revolution of October sweeps across Russia, the system changes its face but keeps its cruelty. The new order has no place for a woman who represents the old spirit of honor. To the Bolsheviks, Maria Bochkareva is a mechanical failure of the past, a ghost that needs to be exorcised. The ghost in the machine is finally cornered in May 1920. Maria is no longer at the head of a battalion. She is in a cold cell in Krasnoyarsk, held by the Cheka, the secret police of the new Soviet world. They don't see the veteran of Smorgon, They don't see the woman who stood before Kerensky. They see a class enemy. The final micro scene takes place in a courtyard, the air smelling of damp stone and the metallic tang of an impending Siberian spring. A young Cheka officer, barely 20, stand before her. He wasn't at Smorgon. He never saw the charge. He only knows the manual of the party. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, Maria," he says, his voice flat and devoid of the human spirit. "You tried to save an empire that was already rotten. You were a fool to believe in honor when the world was moving toward power." Maria Bochkareva, the woman who shamed 5 million men, simply looks at him. She doesn't beg. She doesn't offer a speech. She has already seen the modern echo of her own sacrifice. She knows that the system, whether it wears a czar's crown or a commissar's star, will always fear the individual who cannot be bought or broken. The time freeze occurs as the firing squad levels their rifles. Maria closes her eyes. She doesn't hear the command to fire. She hears the sound of 2,000 women's hair falling to the floor in a quiet room in Petrograd. She hears the rhythmic thud of boots on the parade ground. The shots ring out, and the Battalion of Death is finally, officially, erased from the Soviet record. We look back at 1917 and we see a world of grand ideologies: communism, democracy, imperialism. But beneath the massive system, there was a human heart that the world deemed too fragile for war. Maria Bochkareva and her women didn't die for a czar or a map. They died for the idea that even in the middle of a collapsing civilization, an individual still has the agency to say no to the rot. Do we see this same hubris in our society today? Do we still ignore the warnings of the underdogs because they don't fit the manual of our modern experts? History suggests that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the person who has nothing left to lose but their honor. The Battalion of Death was meant to be a rebuke. In the end, it became a mirror. And what it reflected was a world that would rather kill its heroes than admit they were right. If you believe that stories like Maria Bochkareva's deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing. Your support ensures that the voices history tried to bury are finally heard. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.